The silence had become Marcus Whitfield's closest companion. For 10 years, it had wrapped around him like the mountain mist that clung to the peaks of the Colorado Rockies, thick and impenetrable. 10 years since he'd last heard his own voice echo off canyon walls. 10 years since words had felt worth speaking. But on this particular October morning, as frost painted silver patterns on his cabin windows and the aspen leaves trembled gold in the thin mountain air, that silence was about to be shattered by 4 simple words: "Please say my name." The woman who would speak them lay unconscious in a snowbank 3 miles down the mountain, her dark hair stark against the white, her breathing shallow but steady. She had no way of knowing that the man who would find her had sworn a vow of silence after losing everything that mattered. She couldn't know that her arrival would crack open a decade of self-imposed isolation, or that her desperate request would force him to choose between the safety of silence and the terrifying vulnerability of human connection. What she would learn when she finally opened her eyes was that some silences are not chosen but forced upon us by tragedy. And sometimes it takes a stranger's courage to help us find our voice again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The avalanche that killed Marcus Whitfield's family began as a whisper, a subtle shift in the snowpack, high above their remote cabin in the San Juan Mountains. It was February 14th, 2014, and what should have been a day of love and laughter became the moment that silence claimed him forever. Marcus had been splitting wood behind their cabin when he felt a tremor in the earth beneath his boots, so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. The winter had been harsh that year, with record snowfall burying the high country under 20 feet of white. Sarah, his wife of 8 years, had been inside preparing Valentine's Day breakfast for their twin daughters, Emma and Grace, both 6 years old and already showing signs of their mother's stubborn independence and their father's love for the mountains. "Daddy!" Grace's voice had carried through the thin mountain air from where she and Emma were building a snow fort near the tree line. "Come see what we made." Those were the last words Marcus heard his daughter speak. The sound came next not the thunderous roar that movies depicted, but a deep, bone-shaking rumble that seemed to rise from the mountain itself. Marcus dropped his axe and spun toward the source, his logger's instincts honed by 15 years in these mountains screaming danger. What he saw made his blood freeze colder than the mountain wind. A white wall of death was racing down the mountainside, gathering speed and mass with each passing second. Trees that had stood for centuries snapped like matchsticks. Boulders the size of trucks tumbled within the churning mass like pebbles in a stream. And directly in its path were Emma and Grace, their bright red snowsuits making them look like tiny cardinals against the white landscape. Marcus ran. He ran harder than he'd ever run in his life, his boots finding purchase on the icy ground through sheer desperation. Behind him, he could hear Sarah screaming from the cabin doorway, could hear the avalanche's roar growing louder, closer, inevitable. 20 yards, 15, 10. He dove for his daughters, just as the wall of snow and debris slammed into them all. When Marcus regained consciousness 3 hours later, he was buried up to his chest in snow so dense he could barely move. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle broken. He realized dimly, and blood from a head wound had frozen in his beard. But he was alive, which seemed impossible given the tons of snow that had swept over them. The silence was the first thing he noticed. Complete, absolute silence where moments before there had been the mountain's fury. No wind, no birds, no voices. The world had been scrubbed clean of sound, leaving only the ragged rasp of his own breathing. "Sarah!" he called out, or tried to. His voice came out as barely a whisper, his throat raw from inhaling snow and debris. "Emma, Grace!" He struggled against the snow that held him, ignoring the fire in his broken arm, using his good hand to claw at the white prison. It took him another hour to dig himself free, And when he finally stood on shaking legs, the landscape had been transformed beyond recognition. Where their cabin had stood, the cabin he'd built, with his own hands from trees he'd felled on this very mountain, there was nothing but a field of snow and scattered debris. A piece of their red front door lay 30 yards away. Sarah's coffee mug, miraculously unbroken, sat perched on a boulder like some surreal monument to their vanished life. Marcus searched for 6 days. He dug until his hands bled, until exhaustion forced him to stop, until the rescue teams arrived and gently but firmly told him there was no hope. The avalanche had moved too much snow, buried everything too deep. His family was gone, erased as completely as if they had never existed. The funeral was held in Denver, where Sarah's family lived. Marcus sat in the front pew of a church that felt alien and hostile after years in the mountains, listening to a preacher who had never met his wife and daughters try to make sense of their deaths. Words like God's plan and taken too soon washed over him like water over stone, meaningless and cold. He spoke at the service, said the words people expected to hear about love and loss and the hope of reunion in some distant heaven. But even as the words left his mouth, Marcus felt something inside him breaking, some fundamental connection between thought and speech severing like a cut wire. After the funeral, Sarah's mother approached him with tears in her eyes and a question that would haunt him. What will you do now, Marcus? You can't go back up there alone. But he could, and he did. He returned to the mountain, not because it felt like home, nothing would ever feel like home again, but because it was the only place where the silence made sense. In the city, silence was absence, a void that others rushed to fill with meaningless chatter. On the mountain, silence was presence, the mountain's own voice, ancient and patient and eternal. Marcus rebuilt, not his life, but a survival routine. He salvaged what he could from the avalanche site tools, some clothing, a few photographs that had somehow survived. He built a new cabin, smaller and more austere, 2 miles from where the old one had stood. He re-established the basic necessities: water, heat, shelter, food, but he didn't rebuild his voice. The first year was the hardest. Well-meaning friends and relatives made the trek up the mountain to check on him, bringing supplies and concern in equal measure. They spoke to him, at him, around him, filling the air with words that seemed to bounce off the walls of his silence like stones off water. "You need to talk to someone, Marcus," his brother-in-law David had said during one of these visits. "This isn't healthy. Sarah wouldn't want you living like this." Marcus had simply stared at him until David's words dried up and blew away on the mountain wind. What could he possibly say that would matter? That would bring back 3 voices that had been silenced forever? The mathematics of it were simple and brutal. He had been given a choice between his voice and their deaths, and the universe had taken both. By the 2nd year, the visits stopped. By the 3rd, even the Forest Service rangers who occasionally checked on remote residents had noted his preference for solitude and began leaving supplies at a designated drop point rather than approaching his cabin directly. The post office in the nearest town, Pine Ridge, held his mail and packages, understanding through some small-town telepathy that Marcus Whitfield was not a man who welcomed conversation. The mountain community had its share of hermits and loners, people who came to the high country to escape the noise and complications of civilization. But Marcus was different. He wasn't antisocial or misanthropic. He simply existed in a state of profound silence, like a man-shaped absence in the world of words. His days developed a rhythm that required no speech. He rose with the sun and checked his snares, harvested from the garden he maintained behind his cabin, chopped and stacked wood for the fires that would keep him alive through the brutal mountain winters. He read voraciously books ordered online and delivered to Pine Ridge, where the postmaster, Mrs. Chun, had learned to expect his weekly appearance and his silent nod of thanks. Occasionally, necessity forced him into town for supplies his isolated life couldn't provide. These trips were exercises in precision, planned and executed with military efficiency. He would arrive at Henderson's general store with a written list, select what he needed, and pay with exact change or a credit card. That eliminated the need for verbal transactions. The townspeople had grown accustomed to his silence, treating it with the same matter-of-fact acceptance they might show for a physical disability. "Morning, Marcus," Henderson himself would say, and Marcus would nod, and that would be the entire extent of their interaction. It worked for everyone involved. The silence deepened with each passing year, becoming not just an absence of speech, but a fundamental alteration of his relationship with the world. He began to hear things others missed, the subtle shift in wind patterns that preceded storms, the different qualities of snow as it fell, the complex conversations of the wildlife that shared his mountain domain. The silence had become his teacher, showing him layers of communication that existed beyond words. He learned the language of seasons, could read approaching weather in the behavior of birds and the smell of the air. He understood the mountain's moods, knew when avalanche conditions were building, when rockslides threatened, when the delicate balance of the high country ecosystem was shifting. In some ways, he had become more attuned to the world around him than he had ever been when his life was filled with human voices. But understanding and connection were different things. Marcus lived in a world of profound observation without participation, like a naturalist studying a foreign species from behind glass. He saw and heard and understood, but he did not engage. The silence protected him from the pain of loss, but also from the possibility of new pain, new connection, new vulnerability. 10 years. 10 winters of solitude. 10 springs of watching the mountain come alive again without his voice joining the chorus. 10 years of silence so complete that sometimes, lying in his narrow bed and listening to the wind, Marcus wondered if he still possessed the ability to speak at all, or if his vocal cords had atrophied from disuse like unused muscles. He had tested this fear only once, on the 5th anniversary of the avalanche. Standing at the site where his family had died, he had opened his mouth and tried to say Sarah's name. The sound that emerged was barely recognizable as human, a harsh croak that startled a nearby elk and sent it bounding away through the trees. The failure had terrified him more than he cared to admit. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect, that his silence was no longer chosen but compulsory, a physiological reality that matched his emotional state. His voice was gone, not just unused but unusable, as buried under years of silence as his family was buried under tons of snow. So he had made peace with the permanence of his condition, accepting it as he had accepted the mountain's weather and seasons, a fundamental characteristic of his existence that could no more be changed than the direction of magnetic north, which made the events of that October morning all the more impossible to believe. As Marcus checked his snares in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath visible in the frigid air, he had no way of knowing that 3 miles below his cabin, a young woman named Claire Patterson was fighting for her life in a snowbank, her car having slid off the treacherous mountain road in a late-season storm. He had no way of knowing that her survival would depend on his willingness to break a decade of silence, and he certainly had no way of knowing that when he found her, her first conscious words would be a request that would shatter his carefully constructed world of silence forever. "Please say my name." The morning mist was just beginning to lift from the valley when Marcus made his discovery. The silence that had been his companion for 10 years was about to meet its end. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The October storm had come out of nowhere, transforming the mountain roads from merely treacherous to downright deadly in a matter of hours. Claire Patterson gripped the steering wheel of her rented Toyota Camry with white knuckles, her city driving experience proving woefully inadequate for the winding mountain highway that carved its way through the Colorado Rockies like a snake made of asphalt and false hope. She shouldn't have been on this road at all. The rental car agent in Denver had specifically warned against mountain driving without chains, especially this late in the season. But Claire was desperate, driven by a deadline that made caution seem like a luxury she couldn't afford. Her editor at Wilderness Quarterly had given her one last chance to prove herself as a journalist. And this story, The Mysterious Hermit of the San Juan Mountains, was either going to save her career or end it completely. There's a guy up there who hasn't spoken to another human being in 10 years. Her editor, Janet Morrison, had told her 3 days earlier. Local legend says he survived the avalanche that killed his family back in 2014. Now he lives completely alone, never talks to anyone, just exists like some kind of mountain ghost. Could be complete bullshit. Could be the story that puts our magazine back on the map. You've got 1 week to find out which. Claire had jumped at the assignment despite the risks. At 28, she was already considered past her prime in the cutthroat world of magazine journalism, especially after the disaster of her last story, an expose on corruption in Denver City planning department that had fallen apart when her primary source recanted his testimony. 3 months of unemployment had drained her savings and left her desperate enough to chase rumors into the wilderness. The GPS on her phone had lost signal an hour ago, somewhere around the town of Pine Ridge, leaving her to navigate by the increasingly unreliable road signs and her own questionable sense of direction. The storm clouds had been gathering since noon, but weather reports had promised clear skies until evening. Like most things in Claire's life lately, the reality had diverged sharply from the plan. Snow began falling just as she passed a sign marking the elevation at 9,000 feet. Light flakes at first, dancing in her headlight beams like tiny performers. But within minutes, the snowfall intensified into a curtain of white that reduced visibility to mere yards. The temperature gauge on her dashboard showed 28 degrees and dropping. Claire's hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, hoping against hope that she might catch a signal. Nothing. The screen showed the dreaded no service message that had become the story of her professional life, always just out of reach of the connections she needed. She pressed on, reasoning that turning around on the narrow mountain road would be more dangerous than continuing forward. There had to be a place to stop ahead, a ranger station or another town where she could wait out the storm. The alternative, spending the night in a rental car on a mountain road in a blizzard, was unthinkable. The road curved sharply to the left, following the contour of a ridge that dropped away into darkness on her right. Claire touched the brakes gently, remembering the advice about avoiding sudden movements on slippery surfaces. But the car had already begun to slide, its front-wheel drive system no match for the accumulating snow and ice. What happened next unfolded with the horrible slow-motion clarity that accompanies disasters. The car's rear end swung wide on the turn, overcorrecting her steering input. She felt the exact moment when the tires lost their grip entirely, when physics took over and human agency became irrelevant. The guardrail approached with dreamlike inevitability, and Claire had just enough time to think, "This is how I die," before the impact threw her world into chaos. The car punched through the guardrail like it was made of paper, tumbling down the steep embankment in a series of bone-jarring impacts. Claire's seatbelt saved her life, but not her consciousness. Somewhere between the second and third roll, darkness claimed her. When she woke, the world had gone completely silent. Claire's first sensation was cold, not the gentle chill of autumn air, but the bone-deep, life-threatening cold that spoke of serious trouble. Her second was pain, a symphony of aches and sharp stings that suggested she was badly hurt, but probably not dying. Her third was the absolute stillness of the world around her. She lay in what felt like a cocoon of snow, her body half buried in the white stuff that had cushioned her fall and probably saved her life. The car, she could see it now, a crumpled shadow against a grove of pine trees about 20 feet away, had come to rest upside down, its headlights still glowing weakly through the falling snow like dying stars. Claire tried to move and immediately regretted it. Her left ankle screamed in protest, probably sprained or worse. Her ribs ached with each breath, suggesting bruising if not fractures. Her head throbbed with the distinctive pain of a concussion, and when she touched her forehead, her fingers came away sticky with blood. But she was alive, which seemed like a minor miracle given the violence of the crash. The snow that had made the road impassable had also provided a relatively soft landing at the bottom of the embankment. The irony wasn't lost on her save by the same weather that had nearly killed her. The immediate question was survival. Claire's journalism training had included a basic wilderness safety course, enough to know that her situation was dire. She was injured, alone, and effectively invisible to any potential rescue efforts. The car was too damaged to provide shelter, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Night was falling, and with it, temperatures that could kill an injured person in a matter of hours. She forced herself to take inventory. Her purse had survived the crash, containing her wallet, phone, still showing no signal, a granola bar, and a small bottle of water. Her jacket was warm, but not designed for prolonged exposure to mountain weather. Her boots were fashionable rather than functional, already soaked through from the snow. The car might yield additional supplies. Claire dragged herself toward the wreckage, using her arms to pull her body through the snow, since putting weight on her injured ankle was impossible. The driver's side door hung open, its window shattered but the frame intact. Her overnight bag had spilled its contents across the inverted ceiling clothes. Toiletries, a small first aid kit, and her laptop computer, now decorated with spider web cracks across its screen. More importantly, she found the emergency kit that the rental company had mentioned but never explained. A thermal blanket, a basic first aid kit, a small flashlight, and 3 protein bars. Not enough to sustain her for long, but enough to buy time if help was coming. The problem was that help wasn't coming. No one knew exactly where she was. Her editor expected a check-in call tomorrow, but wouldn't start worrying for at least another day after that. The rental car company wouldn't report the vehicle missing until she failed to return it, which gave her 3 more days. By then, if she was still alive, she would be in no condition to care about deadlines or career prospects. Claire wrapped herself in the thermal blanket and tried to think rationally about her options. The road above was clearly impassable, and even if another vehicle attempted the journey, the broken guardrail might not be visible in the storm. Her phone was useless, and even if she could somehow climb back to the road, walking for help in her condition would be suicide. That left waiting and hoping someone would find her, or attempting to find shelter and help on her own dot, as if in response to her thoughts. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontal and reminding her that staying put wasn't really an option. The temperature was dropping fast, and the thermal blanket, while better than nothing, wouldn't keep her alive through a mountain night. She needed real shelter, and she needed it soon. Claire forced herself to study the terrain around the crash site. The embankment rose steeply behind her, too steep to climb with her injured ankle. To her left and right, the slope continued downward, following what appeared to be a natural drainage. Ahead, through the swirling snow, she could make out what might be a creek or stream, marked by a line of larger trees. Water meant the possibility of shelter overhangs, caves, or at least wind protection among the larger trees. It also meant the possibility of following the watercourse to civilization, though in her condition, that was a long shot at best. She gathered the useful supplies from the car, stuffing them into her overnight bag and slinging it across her shoulder. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her ribs, but pain was preferable to death. Using a piece of the car's antenna as a makeshift walking stick, Claire began her descent toward the tree line. Progress was agonizingly slow. The snow was knee-deep in places, and her injured ankle collapsed beneath her every few steps, sending her sprawling face first into the white. Each fall soaked her clothing further, and she could feel her core temperature beginning to drop. The early stages of hypothermia. She recognized the uncontrollable shivering, the difficulty concentrating, the strange sense of detachment from her own body. By the time she reached the trees, full darkness had fallen, and Claire knew she was in serious trouble. The flashlight revealed what she had hoped for: a small creek running between banks lined with larger rocks and fallen logs. But it also revealed what she had feared: no obvious shelter, no sign of human presence, no indication that rescue was likely. She found a spot where a large pine had fallen across the creek, creating a natural lean-to with its upturned root system. It wasn't much, but the roots blocked the wind and the space beneath the trunk was relatively dry. Claire crawled into this marginal shelter and tried to make herself as small as possible, conserving what little body heat remained. The night stretched ahead of her like an eternity. Each hour seemed to last forever, marked only by the chattering of her teeth and the occasional groan of wind-stressed trees. The protein bars helped temporarily, giving her body fuel to burn for warmth, but 3 bars wouldn't last long. The water in her bottle began to develop a skin of ice. Sometime around midnight, Claire began to hallucinate. The hypothermia was advancing, she realized distantly, affecting her brain's ability to distinguish reality from fantasy. She saw her apartment in Denver, warm and bright and impossibly far away. She saw her mother, dead now for 5 years, sitting beside her and stroking her hair. She saw her editor, Janet, shaking her head in disappointment at another failed assignment. Should have stayed in the city, the imaginary Janet said. Should have known better than to chase ghost stories in the wilderness. But she had to chase them, had to try, because the alternative was admitting defeat, accepting that her dreams of being a real journalist were just that, dreams. Claire Patterson had always been the type to chase impossible stories, to believe that somewhere out there was the one perfect piece of journalism that would make everything worthwhile. As dawn approached, bringing with it the pale gray light that filtered through the storm clouds, Claire made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She was going to die on this mountain, that much seemed certain now. But she wasn't going to die passively, waiting for rescue that wouldn't come. If these were her last hours, she was going to spend them doing what she did best: investigating, exploring, following the story wherever it led. The mysterious hermit she had come to find was supposedly somewhere in these mountains. If she was going to die looking for him, she might as well die trying to complete her assignment. There was something almost poetic about it, a journalist's final story being her own, demise in pursuit of another recluse's tale. Claire forced herself to stand, ignoring the screaming protests from her ankle and ribs. The storm had abated slightly during the night, reducing from a blizzard to steady snowfall. Visibility had improved to maybe 50 yards. If there was any chance of finding shelter or help, this might be her only opportunity. She began following the creek upstream, reasoning that water sources in the mountains often led to human habitation, even if that habitation was just the cabin of a hermit who hadn't spoken in 10 years. Each step was an act of will, a deliberate choice to continue fighting despite the odds. What Claire didn't know was that less than 3 miles ahead, Marcus Whitfield was beginning his morning routine, checking snares and preparing for another day of purposeful silence. She couldn't know that her struggle for survival was about to intersect with his decade of self-imposed isolation in ways that would challenge everything both of them believed about themselves. All she knew was that somewhere ahead, through the snow and trees and gathering morning light, lay either her salvation or her final resting place. And for the first time in months, Claire Patterson felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, in pursuit of a story that mattered. Even if she never lived to tell it, Marcus Whitfield's morning routine had remained unchanged for 10 years. Rise before dawn. Check the weather by the feel of the air through his cabin's single window. Dress in layers, wool socks, thermal underwear, flannel shirt, down vest, waterproof jacket. Lace his boots with the methodical precision of a man who understood that carelessness in the mountains could mean death. Step outside and listen to what the mountain had to say. This particular morning, the mountain was speaking in whispers. Overnight storm had deposited 8 inches of fresh snow, but the winds had died to almost nothing, creating that peculiar hush that settled over the high country after a weather event. Marcus moved through this silence like a ghost through his own domain, his footsteps muffled by the snow, his breathing barely visible in the cold air. His first destination was always the weather station. He had built behind his cabin a collection of instruments salvaged from his previous life as a wilderness guide and arranged with the precision of a man whose survival depended on accurate information. Barometric pressure, rising slowly. Wind speed, 2 miles per hour from the northwest. Temperature, 21 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing toward what promised to be a clear, cold day. The snare line came next. Marcus had positioned 12 snares along game trails within a 2-mile radius of his cabin, each one carefully placed to maximize efficiency while minimizing suffering. This wasn't sport hunting, but subsistence, and he approached it with the same grim professionalism he brought to all aspects of his mountain existence. The first 3 snares were empty, their triggers undisturbed by the night's activities. The 4th held a snowshoe hare, already frozen stiff in the morning cold. Marcus dispatched it quickly and humanely, adding it to the game bag he carried. Protein for the next 2 days, if he was careful with portions. It was at the 7th snare, positioned along what had once been a deer trail near Willow Creek, that Marcus encountered something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Footprints. In the fresh snow. Human footprints. Marcus crouched beside the trail, his trained eye automatically cataloging the details. Adult human, based on the size. Female, judging by the narrow width and the gait pattern. Moving upstream along the creek. Bed. The prints were deep, suggesting someone carrying extra weight or struggling with each step. Most telling of all, they were fresh, no more than a few hours old, made after the snow had stopped falling. For a man who had lived in complete isolation for a decade, the discovery was as shocking as finding footprints on the moon. No one came this high anymore, especially not in late October when early storms could trap the unprepared. The nearest hiking trail was miles away, and it had been officially closed for the season a week ago. Marcus followed the trail upstream, his curiosity overcoming years of carefully cultivated indifference to the outside world. The footprints told a story that grew more concerning with each step. The person was moving erratically, sometimes veering toward the water's edge, sometimes stumbling off the game trail entirely. There were places where the snow showed clear evidence of falls, and one spot where Marcus found drops of blood frozen, dark against the white. Someone was in serious trouble. The practical part of Marcus's mind, the part that had kept him alive through 10 mountain winters, suggested he should turn around and return to his cabin. Whoever was out here had made their own choices and would have to live with the consequences. He had no obligation to help, no responsibility for the poor decisions of others. His survival depended on maintaining his isolation and contact with the outside world could only bring complications he didn't need. But there was another part of his mind, buried but not dead, that remembered what it felt like to be responsible for other people's welfare. The part that had once guided inexperienced hikers through these same mountains, that had taught wilderness survival skills to kids from Denver, that had kissed his daughters goodnight and promised Sarah he would always keep them safe. That part of him continued following the footprints upstream. The trail led him further from his cabin than he had ventured in months, into territory he knew well but avoided out of habit rather than necessity. The creek wound through a series of shallow pools separated by small waterfalls, each one frozen into fantastic sculptures of ice that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The footprints showed that the person had struggled to navigate these obstacles, sometimes crawling on hands and knees to get around the worst spots. Marcus was beginning to think he would find a body when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the gurgle of running water. A cough. Human and definitely alive. He moved more carefully now, his woodsman's instincts taking over. The sound had come from ahead, probably around the next bend in the creek, where a stand of old-growth pines provided shelter from the wind. Marcus approached from downwind, staying low and quiet out of habit rather than any conscious plan. What he found when he peered through the trees stopped him cold. Woman sat propped against the base of a massive pine tree, wrapped in what appeared to be a reflective emergency blanket. Her dark hair was matted with snow and what looked like dried blood, and her face was pale with the telltale flush of hypothermia. She was young, maybe late 20s, and clearly in bad shape. An overnight bag sat beside her, and Marcus could see the remnants of what had probably been her last meal scattered in the snow around her feet. But she was conscious, and more importantly, she was looking directly at him. Their eyes met across 30 feet of snow-covered ground, and Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years, the shock of unexpected human contact. For a moment, neither of them moved. The woman's eyes were wide with surprise and what might have been relief. Marcus felt his own heart racing with an adrenaline response he'd forgotten he was capable of. The woman tried to speak, but what came out was barely a whisper, her voice hoarse with cold and dehydration. She tried again, and this time Marcus caught the words, "Please ... help me." It was the first time in 10 years that another human being had spoken directly to Marcus Whitfield. The first time since Sarah's funeral that someone had looked at him and expected a response, a connection, an acknowledgement of shared humanity. Marcus stood frozen, trapped between his instinct to help and his decade-deep commitment to isolation. The smart thing would be to leave, to pretend he'd never seen her, to let nature take its course as it had with his own family. But looking at this woman, this stranger who had somehow survived a night in the mountains and was now looking at him with desperate hope, Marcus found himself moving forward instead of away. He approached slowly, hands visible, the way he might approach a wounded animal. The woman watched him with alert but fading eyes, and Marcus could see she was fighting to stay conscious. Hypothermia, dehydration, probably injuries from whatever had brought her this far into the wilderness. She needed help immediately if she was going to survive. When he was close enough to see the details, the cut on her forehead, the way she favored her left ankle, the blue tinge to her lips, Marcus knelt in the snow beside her and did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He opened his mouth to speak. What came out wasn't words but a harsh, croaking sound that barely qualified as human communication. His vocal cords, unused for so long, produced noise but not language. Marcus cleared his throat and tried again, but the result was the same, a guttural rasp that startled them both. The woman's eyes widened, not with fear but with understanding. Somehow, impossibly, she seemed to recognize what was happening. You don't talk," she said, her voice stronger now despite her condition. It wasn't a question but a statement of fact, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who was used to dealing with unusual situations. Marcus nodded, surprised by the relief he felt at being understood without having to explain. "That's okay," the woman continued, managing what might have been a smile despite her obvious pain. "I'm Claire Patterson, and I think you might be exactly who I was looking for." The statement made no sense to Marcus. No one was looking for him. No one even knew he existed anymore, except as a vague rumor in the valley towns below. But there was something in the woman's eyes, Claire's eyes, that suggested this. Meeting wasn't as accidental as it appeared. Marcus stood and gestured for Claire to stay put, then began systematically checking her condition with the clinical efficiency he'd learned during his years as a wilderness guide. Her pulse was rapid but strong. Her pupils responded normally to light when he used his flashlight to check them. The cut on her forehead was shallow, already stopped bleeding. Her ankle was swollen, but probably sprained rather than broken. Most critically, her core temperature was dangerously low. The emergency blanket had probably saved her life, but she needed warmth, food, and proper shelter if she was going to recover fully. Marcus made his decision with the same quick calculation he brought to all survival situations. The woman Claire was in immediate danger and needed help. His cabin was the closest shelter, and he had the supplies necessary to treat hypothermia. The complications that would come with bringing an outsider into his carefully constructed world of silence were problems for later. Right now, there was only the simple equation of life and death. He gestured for Claire to wait, then began gathering her scattered belongings. Her overnight bag revealed the remnants of what had clearly been a desperate night: empty protein bar wrappers, a water bottle with ice crystals forming around the edges, and something that made Marcus pause: a small digital recorder and a notebook. Filled with handwritten notes, the visible pages contained references to the Hermit of San Juan, 10 years of silence, and survivor of the 2014 avalanche. Claire Patterson wasn't just a lost hiker who had stumbled into his territory by accident. She was here specifically looking for him, under normal circumstances. This discovery would have sent Marcus fleeing back to his cabin to gather his essential supplies and relocate to one of the emergency shelters he maintained deeper in the mountains. The idea of being hunted, even by someone as harmless as an injured journalist, violated every principle he'd established for his isolated existence. But these weren't normal circumstances. Claire was dying, and whatever her original intentions, they were irrelevant now. She needed help, and he was the only person in 100 square miles capable of providing it. Marcus secured Claire's belongings in her bag, then knelt beside her. Again, he pointed to himself, then gestured up the mountain toward his cabin. Claire nodded, understanding. "You're going to help me," she said. And again it wasn't a question, but a statement of recognition. Marcus nodded once, then began the process of getting Claire ready for transport. The trip back to his cabin would be difficult under the best circumstances, and with an injured person, it would be dangerous. But the alternative was watching her die, and that was something Marcus Whitfield had seen enough of for one lifetime. As he fashioned a makeshift sled from pine branches and his emergency tarp, Marcus caught Claire watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. Something more like recognition, as if she had expected to find exactly this: a silent man in the mountains who would help her without being asked, who would act instead of speaking. "My name is Claire Patterson," she said again, as he prepared to move her. "I'm a journalist from Denver, and I came here looking for you. But right now, none of that matters. Right now, I just need you to keep me alive." Marcus met her eyes and nodded once more. Whatever complications this woman would bring to his carefully ordered existence, whatever disruption her presence would cause to his decade of silence, those were concerns for tomorrow. Today, there was only the immediate need to get her to safety, to provide warmth and shelter and the basic human care that had once been as natural to him as breathing. As he began pulling the improvised sled through the snow toward his cabin, Marcus found himself thinking about the strange chain of circumstances that had brought Claire Patterson into his world. The late-season storm that had probably caused her accident, the route she had chosen that led her to his section of the mountains, the fact that she had survived a night in conditions that should have killed her. It felt less like coincidence and more like inevitability, as if the mountain itself had delivered this challenge to his doorstep for reasons he couldn't yet understand. Behind him, Claire drifted in and out of consciousness as the sled moved through the snow, but he could hear her breathing, steady and strong despite everything she had endured. Alive, for the first time in 10 years, Marcus Whitfield was responsible for keeping another human being alive. And the weight of that responsibility felt both terrifying and strangely familiar, like coming home to a place he'd forgotten he knew how to reach. The first thing Claire noticed when she regained full consciousness was the warmth. Not the artificial Heat of modern civilization, but the deep, penetrating warmth that only comes from a wood fire burning in a well-built stone hearth. The second thing she noticed was the silence, not the empty silence of isolation, but the comfortable quiet of a space where noise was unnecessary. She lay on what felt like a genuine feather mattress, covered with layers of wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and pine smoke. Her injured ankle was elevated and wrapped in what appeared to be professionally applied bandages. Someone had changed her out of her wet clothes and into thermal underwear and wool socks that were clearly not her own. The cabin around her was unlike anything she had expected. Claire had imagined the hermit's dwelling as a crude shelter, the kind of primitive structure that appeared in survival documentaries. Instead, she found herself in a space that spoke of careful craftsmanship and deliberate design. Hand-hewn log walls fitted together with mathematical precision. A stone fireplace that radiated heat efficiently throughout the single large room. Windows positioned to maximize natural light while maintaining privacy. Built-in furniture that served multiple functions. A dining table that doubled as a workspace. Benches with storage compartments. Shelves lined with more books than some city apartments contained. This wasn't the lair of a madman or the desperate shelter of a broken survivor. This was the home of someone who had chosen his isolation deliberately and built his world to support it. Marcus sat at the far end of the room, near a window that looked out over the valley below. He was reading, actually reading, not just passing time with the focused attention of someone for whom books were companions rather than entertainment. When he noticed Claire was awake, he set the book aside and approached her with the careful, measured movements of someone accustomed to living alone. He held up a ceramic mug, steam rising from its contents, and raised his eyebrows in question. Claire nodded, and he helped her sit up enough to drink. The liquid was some kind of herbal tea, bitter but warming, with an aftertaste that spoke of knowledge about mountain plants and their properties. "Thank you," Claire said, and was surprised by how normal her voice sounded. "How long was I out?" Marcus held up 2 fingers, then pointed toward the window where afternoon light was slanting through the trees. 2 days? Claire asked, alarmed. Marcus shook his head and pointed to the light again, then made a sweeping gesture from one side to the other. 2 hours past noon? Claire guessed. Marcus nodded, then brought her more tea and what appeared to be homemade bread with honey. As Claire ate, she studied her silent host with the analytical eye that had served her well as a journalist. Marcus Whitfield, and she was certain this was who he was, looked nothing like the wild mountain man of local legend. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair clean and pulled back in a simple ponytail. His clothes were practical but well-maintained. His hands, as he helped her with the food, were calloused but clean, with the long fingers of someone who worked with tools and precision. Most importantly, his eyes were clear and alert, showing none of the disconnection from reality that she might have expected from someone who had lived alone for a decade. If anything, he seemed more present, more aware of his surroundings than most people she knew. "You can't speak," Claire said gently. It wasn't a question. She had seen his attempts at communication the day before and understood that this wasn't a choice but a condition. Marcus nodded, then surprised her by producing a small notebook and pencil from his shirt pocket. He wrote something and showed it to her. Vocal cords work. Words don't come. The distinction was important, Claire realized. This wasn't a physical disability, but something else, a psychological barrier that had developed over years of disuse. She had heard of similar cases in her research, trauma victims who lost the ability to speak not because of physical damage, but because of emotional wounds that ran too deep for words. "Is it because of your family?" she asked softly. "The avalanche?" Marcus's hand stopped moving across the paper. For a moment, his composure cracked, and Claire saw the raw pain that lived beneath his careful control. Then he nodded once and wrote, "Some things are too big for words." Claire felt a surge of professional excitement mixed with genuine compassion. This was the story she had come to find. But it was also a human being whose privacy she was invading, whose carefully constructed world she was disrupting simply by being here. "I should explain why I'm here," she said. "I'm a journalist. I came looking for you specifically." Marcus's expression didn't change, but she saw him stiffen slightly. He wrote, "How many know? About you specifically?" "Almost no one. There are rumors in the Valley Town stories about a hermit who survived the avalanche that killed his family. But most people think you're either dead or a legend." Marcus seemed to relax slightly at this news. He wrote, "Good. Need to stay that way. Why?" Claire asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then began writing more extensively. "Outside world brings complications, questions, people who want to help or save or fix. This works." "This is enough." Claire read the words and felt a pang of guilt. She was exactly the kind of complication he was describing, a representative of the outside world, who wanted to help and fix and, yes, profit from his story. But she was also trapped here by circumstances beyond either of their control, dependent on his kindness for her survival. "I understand," she said. "And I want you to know that I won't write about you without your permission. I may be a journalist, but I'm not a vulture." Marcus studied her for a moment, then wrote, "What kind of journalist comes alone to the mountains in winter?" Claire laughed, surprising herself. "The desperate kind. The kind whose career is hanging by a thread and who thought finding the legendary hermit of San Juan would save it. And now?" Claire considered the question seriously. Her ankle was healing, but would need at least a week before she could attempt the difficult journey back to civilization. Her car was totaled, her phone still had no signal, and no one would start looking for her for several days. She was completely dependent on this man's continued goodwill, which gave her story a very different perspective than she had originally planned. "Now I'm learning that legends are usually more complicated than the stories make them seem," she said. "And that sometimes the most interesting part isn't what someone is running from, but what they've built while they were running." Marcus looked around his cabin as if seeing it through her eyes, then wrote, 10 years of building. Started with nothing but tools and anger. What changed the anger into this?" Claire gestured around the beautifully crafted space. Marcus was quiet for so long that Claire thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally began writing, his hand moved slowly, as if each word required careful consideration. "Anger burns fuel. Runs out eventually. Had to choose between burning out or building something that would last. Mountain taught me the difference." Over the following days, as Claire's strength returned and her ankle healed, she began to understand what Marcus meant. The mountain wasn't just his home, it was his teacher, his companion, his reason for continuing. He had learned to read its moods and seasons with the intimacy of a longtime lover. He knew when storms were coming hours before they arrived, could predict the behavior of wildlife with uncanny accuracy, understood the subtle rhythms that governed life at high altitude. More importantly, he had learned to find peace within the mountain's immense silence. Claire discovered this through observation rather than conversation, since their communication remained primarily through written notes and gesture. Marcus moved through his daily routines with a kind of mindful precision that she had never seen. In the outside world, every action served a purpose. Nothing was wasted, not time, not energy, not resources. It was efficiency born not of hurry, but of deep understanding. She watched him tend his garden, where he grew hardy vegetables in soil he had built himself from compost and mountain earth. She observed his workshop, where he crafted everything, from furniture to tools, using hand methods that were becoming extinct in the modern world. She saw his library, where hundreds of books on subjects ranging from philosophy to engineering were organized with the care of someone for whom knowledge was precious. "You're not just surviving up here," Claire said one evening as they sat by the fire. "You're thriving." Marcus nodded and wrote, "Difference between existing and living. Took me 5 years to learn it. What was the turning point? Marcus stared into the fire for a long time before answering. Found Sarah's journal, hidden in avalanche debris. Last entry said she worried I would give up if something happened to them. Made me realize giving up was the one thing she feared most. The revelation hit Claire like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't built this life despite his family's death. He had built it because of their life, because of what they had meant to him and what they would have wanted for him. So you chose to live instead of just survive, Claire said. Chose to honor them by becoming someone they would be proud of. Not the broken man who couldn't save them, but the man who could save himself. That night, Claire lay awake listening to the wind in the pines and thinking about the profound transformation she was witnessing. Marcus Whitfield hadn't retreated from the world because he couldn't handle it. He had retreated to it, to a place where he could rebuild himself according to his own values rather than society's expectations. The next morning, she made a request that surprised them both. "Teach me," she said simply. Marcus raised his eyebrows in question. "Teach me how to live like this. How to read the mountain. How to build things that last. How to find peace in silence. I don't know how long I'll be here, but I want to learn what you've learned." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then wrote, "Why?" Claire had been asking herself the same question since she woke up in his cabin. Why did she want to learn skills that would be useless in her Denver apartment? Why was she more interested in understanding Marcus's philosophy than in gathering quotes for her article? "Because I think you've figured out something that the rest of us are missing," she said finally. "Something about what really matters and what doesn't. And because I've spent so much time chasing other people's stories that I've forgotten how to live my own." Marcus nodded slowly, then wrote, "Mountain teaching begins with listening. Can you learn to be quiet?" Claire smiled. "I'm a journalist. Being quiet doesn't come naturally, but I'm willing to try." Then we start with silence, 1 hour each morning. Sit still, listen to what's around you. No words, no thoughts, just attention. And so began Claire's education in the art of mountain living and the discipline of productive solitude. Each morning, she sat on Marcus's front porch and practiced the kind of deep listening he had mastered over his decade of isolation. At first, she heard only the obvious sounds: wind in trees, distant bird calls, the creek running over stones. But gradually, as her attention sharpened, she began to distinguish subtleties that had been invisible to her city-trained senses. She learned to identify different birds by their calls, to predict weather changes by the way animals behaved, to read the mountain's moods and the quality of light and the direction of the wind. Marcus taught her through demonstration rather than explanation, showing her how to split wood efficiently, how to preserve food without refrigeration, how to build fires that burned hot and clean with minimal smoke. More importantly, he taught her how to find contentment in simple tasks done well, how to measure time by natural rhythms rather than artificial schedules, how to distinguish between solitude and loneliness. "I understand now why you don't want to leave," Claire said one afternoon as they worked together in his garden, harvesting the last vegetables before winter set in completely. Marcus paused in his digging and wrote, "Not about not wanting to leave, about not needing to." The distinction was crucial, Claire realized. Marcus hadn't trapped himself in the mountains, he had freed himself there, creating a life so complete and satisfying that the outside world had nothing to offer that could improve upon it. As her second week in the cabin began, Claire found herself facing a question she hadn't expected. When the time came to leave, would she want to go? The answer, she was beginning to suspect, might surprise them both. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Claire's arrival at the cabin. Marcus noticed it during his routine weather check, the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing off the canyon walls, growing louder as the aircraft approached from the south. In 10 years of mountain solitude, Marcus had heard helicopters exactly 3 times, twice for medical evacuations of injured hikers, and once when the Forest Service conducted an aerial survey of fire damage. None of those flights had come this high, and none had circled his valley with the persistent, searching pattern he was hearing now. Claire looked up from where she sat on the cabin's front porch, practicing the morning meditation Marcus had taught her. The routine had become natural to her over the past 2 weeks, an hour of silent observation that started each day with clarity and focus. But the approaching helicopter shattered the mountain's peace, its mechanical noise as jarring as an alarm clock in a cathedral. Search and rescue? She asked, though something in Marcus's expression suggested he didn't think so. Marcus shook his head and pointed toward the cabin. His message was clear. Get inside, stay low, don't be seen. The urgency in his movements told Claire this wasn't a precaution, but a necessity. From inside the cabin, they watched through a gap in the curtains as the helicopter appeared over the tree line, a white aircraft with red markings that Claire recognized as belonging to the Colorado Search and Rescue Organization. It circled the valley twice, flying low enough that she could see figures in the windows scanning the ground below with binoculars. Marcus wrote quickly in his notebook, "Looking for you. Someone reported you missing." The realization hit Claire like a cold wave. Of course someone had reported her missing. Her rental car had been discovered by now, probably by a highway patrol officer investigating the damaged guardrail. The rental company would have provided her information, and her editor Janet would have been contacted when Claire failed to check in as scheduled. "They'll keep searching until they find me," Claire said, understanding the implications immediately. "And when they do... double quotes." Marcus nodded grimly. When they found Claire, they would also discover him. His decade of carefully maintained invisibility would be over, replaced by the kind of attention that would make his mountain sanctuary impossible to maintain. There would be interviews, medical evaluations, social workers concerned about his mental health, family members he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly interested in his welfare. The outside world would crash into his carefully constructed peace like an avalanche of good intentions, and outside world would crash into his carefully constructed peace like an avalanche of good intentions. Bureaucratic necessities. The helicopter completed its search pattern and moved on, but its temporary disappearance did nothing to ease the tension in the cabin. If anything, the return of silence felt ominous rather than peaceful. This was just the beginning of what would certainly be an extensive search operation. "I have to go," Claire said, though the words felt like admitting defeat. "I have to let them find me before they find you." Marcus was already moving, gathering supplies from various parts of the cabin with the efficient haste of someone executing a pre-planned emergency protocol. Claire realized he had thought about this scenario before, had prepared for the day when his isolation might be threatened, and he would need to disappear deeper into the mountains. "Not yet," he wrote. "Storm coming tonight. Search crews won't fly in bad weather. Gives us time to plan." Claire looked out the window at what appeared to be a perfectly clear day, but she had learned to trust Marcus's weather predictions implicitly. If he said a storm was coming, then they had perhaps 12 hours before search operations would be suspended. "What kind of plan?" she asked. Marcus spread a hand-drawn map across his dining table, a detailed topographical representation of the surrounding mountains that was far more accurate than anything the search teams would be using. He had marked various locations with symbols Claire had learned to recognize: his snare lines, emergency shelters, water sources, and what appeared to be several alternate routes through the high country. 3 options, he wrote beside the map. 1. You walk down the road, let them find you, say you've been surviving alone. Protect my location. What's the problem with that option? You're too healthy, too well-equipped. Medical exam will show you've been cared for, not struggling to survive. Questions will follow. Claire studied her reflection in the cabin's mirror and realized Marcus was right. 2 weeks of mountain living had actually improved her appearance. Her injured ankle was completely healed. Her complexion was clearer than it had been in months, and she had gained weight rather than lost it. No one would believe she had been surviving alone in the wilderness. Option 2, I disappear to high shelter. You stay here until found. Say you discovered empty cabin, used it for survival. Gives me time to relocate permanently, Claire considered this possibility and found it deeply unsatisfying. It would save Marcus's immediate privacy, but would still expose his location to the authorities. Investigators would want to know who owned the cabin, how it had been built, why it wasn't on any official records. The trail would lead back to him eventually, and when it did, his options for continued isolation would be severely limited. And option 3? Marcus hesitated before writing, we both disappear. Take winter supplies to high camp. Wait until search ends, then you leave on your own schedule. The suggestion was audacious and appealing in equal measure. Claire had come to love her time on the mountain, had found a peace and purpose in the simple rhythms of Marcus's life that her city existence had never provided. The idea of extending that experience, of spending the winter learning from someone who had mastered the art of meaningful solitude, was tempting beyond reason. That it was also completely impractical. Marcus, I can't just vanish. People are looking for me. My editor, probably my landlord, maybe even my parents if someone tracked them down. If I don't surface soon, this becomes a major news story. Missing journalist in the Colorado mountains, that's the kind of thing that brings federal investigators and media attention, that would make your current problem look like a minor inconvenience. Marcus nodded reluctantly, but Claire could see he was struggling with the implications of her leaving. Over the past 2 weeks, they had developed a routine, a partnership that worked despite or perhaps because of their very different backgrounds. He had become her teacher, and she had become his student, but their relationship had evolved beyond those simple roles into something more complex and meaningful. Fourth option, Marcus wrote suddenly, his hand moving quickly across the paper. You don't leave. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Claire felt her heart rate increase, and not entirely from fear of the search helicopters. What do you mean? Stay, permanently. Learn everything. Become someone who belongs here instead of someone visiting from there. The offer was sincere. Claire realized, and the fact that Marcus had made it revealed how much their time together had meant to him. For a man who had chosen complete isolation, inviting someone to share his mountain permanently was an enormous gesture of trust and affection, but it was also impossible, for reasons that went far beyond the practical difficulties of disappearing from modern society. I can't ask you to give up your solitude for me, Claire said gently. This place, this life, you built it for yourself, to heal from your losses and honor your family's memory. Having me here permanently would change everything about what makes it work for you. Marcus started to write a response, then stopped, his hand frozen over the paper. Claire could see him working through the implications of his own offer, recognizing the truth in her words. His mountain sanctuary had been built around the specific needs of one grieving man learning to live with devastating loss. Adding another person, any other person, would fundamentally alter the dynamics that made his healing possible. The distant sound of helicopter rotors returned, closer this time and accompanied by what sounded like multiple aircraft. Through the window, Claire could see 2 helicopters working in coordination, one flying a grid pattern while the other hovered over specific locations for extended observation. They're not just looking randomly anymore, Claire observed. They've narrowed the search area. Marcus checked his watch and wrote, storm hits in 4 hours. Need to decide before then. Claire found herself facing a choice she hadn't anticipated when she first set out to find the legendary hermit of San Juan. She could try to protect Marcus's secret, but doing so would require lies that probably wouldn't hold up under investigation. She could stay and risk bringing the outside world crashing into his carefully constructed peace. Or she could leave, ending what had become the most meaningful 2 weeks of her adult life and returning to a world that suddenly seemed shallow and chaotic by comparison. The helicopters were close enough now that she could hear radio chatter between the crews, fragments of coordination and status reports that reminded her how much machinery the outside world deployed when one of its members went missing. The contrast with Marcus's elegant simplicity was stark and not particularly flattering to the civilization she represented. "There's something I need to tell you," Claire said suddenly, realizing that her decision required complete honesty. "About why I really came here." Marcus looked up from the map, his expression attentive but not surprised. Claire suspected he had already guessed that her original story wasn't complete. "I told you I was a desperate journalist looking for a career-saving story, and that's true. But it's not the whole truth." She took a deep breath, preparing to reveal something she had never told anyone. "I came here because I was thinking about disappearing myself. Not in the mountains, but permanently. I was in a bad place, Marcus. Really bad. And when I heard the rumors about someone who had successfully vanished from the world, who had found a way to live completely outside the systems that were destroying me, I thought maybe I could learn how to do the same thing." Marcus sat down his pencil and looked at her with an intensity that made Claire feel completely seen and understood. "Finding you, living here for these 2 weeks, it probably saved my life in more ways than just the obvious ones. You showed me that it's possible to build something meaningful out of loss, to find peace without giving up entirely. But you also showed me that running away isn't the same as moving towards something better. What does that mean for your decision?" Marcus wrote. "It means I have to go back," Claire said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "Not because I want to, but because I need to. I need to take what I've learned here and figure out how to apply it in the world I actually belong to. And you need to maintain the sanctuary you've built, the life that works for you exactly as it is." Marcus nodded slowly, and Claire could see both understanding and sadness in his expression. "But first," she continued, "we need to make sure your secret stays safe, and I think I know how to do that." Outside, the helicopters were circling closer, their search pattern tightening around the valley. The storm Marcus had predicted was building on the horizon, dark clouds gathering among the peaks like an army preparing for battle. Time was running out, but Claire's plan was crystallizing with the clarity that came from finally understanding what really mattered. The mountain had taught her many things during her stay, but perhaps the most important lesson was the difference between hiding from problems and solving them. Marcus had initially hidden from his grief on the mountain, but eventually learned to solve it by building a life that honored his loss rather than denying it. Now it was Claire's turn to solve rather than hide, to protect Marcus's peace without compromising her own integrity. The plan she was forming would require courage from both of them, but it might be the only way to preserve what they had both come to treasure, the possibility of finding home in the most unexpected places. The helicopters were close enough now that she could see the faces of the searchers, earnest people doing important work who had no idea that their success might destroy something irreplaceable. But Claire was no longer afraid of being found. She was ready to be found on her own terms. Claire's plan began with a lie that would preserve a deeper truth. "I'm going to tell them I've been unconscious," she explained to Marcus as they worked quickly to prepare for what would be their final hours together. Severe concussion from the car accident, in and out of consciousness for 2 weeks. Memory gaps, disorientation, the whole neurological package. It explains why I survived, but also why I can't give them useful information about this area." Marcus paused in his packing. He was methodically gathering the supplies he would need for an extended stay at one of his high mountain shelters, and wrote, "Medical exam will disprove that. Not necessarily. Concussion symptoms are subjective and difficult to verify after the fact, especially if I present with the right combination of confusion and partial amnesia. Claire had spent the morning researching traumatic brain injury symptoms on Marcus's surprisingly comprehensive medical reference books. I'll remember the crash, remember walking along the creek, then nothing until yesterday when I came to and started signaling for help. It was a sophisticated deception that relied on exploiting the gaps in medical knowledge about consciousness and memory. More importantly, it was a lie designed to protect something valuable rather than to gain undeserved advantage. Marcus considered her plan for several minutes before writing dangerous. If they don't believe you, investigation becomes more intensive. If they don't believe me, I'll deal with that when it happens. But the alternative is definitely exposing you, and I won't do that. The conviction in Claire's voice seemed to convince Marcus that she had fully committed to this course of action. He nodded once and returned to his preparations, but Claire could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control he was maintaining over emotions he couldn't afford to express. The storm Marcus had predicted was building with impressive speed, dark clouds rolling over the peaks like spilled ink. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the past hour, and the wind was picking up, causing the helicopters to struggle with their flight patterns. They had perhaps 2 hours before weather would ground the search operation, giving Marcus the cover he needed to relocate to higher ground. But first, they had to execute the most delicate part of their plan, staging Claire's discovery in a way that would satisfy the searchers while protecting Marcus's existence. The key is location, Claire said, studying Marcus's hand-drawn map. I need to be found somewhere that explains my survival but doesn't lead them back here. Somewhere with natural shelter and water, where someone could reasonably have survived. For 2 weeks. Marcus pointed to a spot about 2 miles downstream from his cabin, where Willow Creek formed a series of pools beneath a rock overhang. Natural windbreak, fresh water, protected from weather. Cave behind waterfall could shelter one person. Claire studied the terrain between the cabin and the suggested location. It was a difficult hike under the best conditions, potentially treacherous in the gathering storm. But it was also far enough from Marcus's cabin that even a thorough investigation of the area wouldn't necessarily reveal his presence. How long to get there? 2 hours if we move carefully. 1 hour if we push hard. And for you to get to your high shelter after that? Marcus consulted his map and wrote 3 hours to reach winter camp. Another hour to make it completely invisible. Mathematics were tight but workable. They would need to leave the cabin within the next 30 minutes to reach the staging area, before the storm made travel impossible. Marcus would then have just enough time to reach his emergency shelter before the searchers resumed operations. Claire felt a profound sadness settling over her as she gathered the few possessions she would need to make her deception convincing. Her backpack, deliberately damaged to show signs of a 2-week ordeal. Her clothes, carefully dirtied and worn to suggest prolonged exposure. Her notebook, with most pages removed to eliminate any evidence of her time at the cabin. But the sadness was mixed with something else, a clarity of purpose that she hadn't felt in months. For the first time since her career began falling apart, Claire was doing something that felt genuinely important, something that aligned with her values rather than contradicting them. Marcus appeared beside her as she made final adjustments to her pack, holding something that made her breath catch. It was a small wooden carving, no bigger than her thumb, shaped like a mountain peak with incredible detail and artistry. The wood was polished smooth, warm to the touch, obviously crafted with great care over many hours. Made this for Sarah, he wrote in his notebook. Never gave it to her. Want you to have it. Claire accepted the carving with trembling hands, understanding the enormous significance of the gift. This wasn't just a memento, it was Marcus sharing something precious from his lost life, trusting her with a piece of his heart that he had kept protected for 10 years. I can't take this, she whispered. You can, you should. Reminds me that some gifts are meant to be given, not kept. The simple statement revealed how much Marcus had changed during their time together. The man who had chosen complete isolation was now choosing connection, even though that connection would be severed in a matter of hours. Claire tucked the carving into her jacket pocket, where it rested against her heart like a talisman. How will I know if you're safe? How will I know if this worked? Marcus thought for a moment, then wrote, Pine Ridge Post Office. Mrs. Chun holds mail for mountain residents. If you don't hear from Whitfield within 1 month, assume plan failed. It was a slender thread of connection, but it was something. Claire memorized the arrangement, then helped Marcus complete his own preparations. Watching him pack was like observing a master craftsman at work, every item selected for maximum utility. Every decision made with the experience of someone who understood exactly what he would need and why. You've done this before, Claire observed. Disappeared to the high country. Twice. Forest Service surveys in 2018 and 2020. Both times spent 6 weeks at winter camp until attention moved elsewhere. The casual mention of these previous disappearances reminded Claire that Marcus's survival wasn't dependent on luck or good intentions. He had developed systems, backup plans, alternative locations that allowed him to vanish completely when necessary. His decade of isolation hadn't been passive hiding, but active preparation for exactly this kind of situation. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Claire took one last look around the space that had become home in ways she hadn't expected. The hand-built furniture, the carefully tended garden visible through the back window, the thousands of books that spoke of a mind engaged with the world despite physical isolation, all of it would remain exactly as it was, waiting for Marcus's return. Like a faithful friend, will you come back here? She asked. Eventually. May need to stay high until spring, depending on how thorough the investigation becomes. But this is home now. First real home since the avalanche. Claire understood. This cabin wasn't just shelter, it was the physical manifestation of Marcus's healing, the proof that he had built something meaningful from devastating loss. Losing it would mean losing years of progress, of carefully constructed peace. They left the cabin as the first snowflakes began to fall, fat flakes that would quickly accumulate into the kind of storm that grounded aircraft and forced search operations to suspend. Marcus moved through the forest with the silent efficiency Claire had come to admire, choosing routes that left minimal tracks, avoiding areas where their passage might be detected by future investigation. The hike to the staging area took them along paths Claire had never seen, through terrain that was spectacular even under the gathering storm clouds. Marcus had chosen a route that avoided his usual travel corridors, ensuring that even if searchers found their trail, it wouldn't lead back to areas he regularly used. As they walked, Claire found herself memorizing details, the way morning light filtered through the pine needles, the sound of wind in the high branches, the particular quality of silence that existed only in places where human noise was the exception rather than the rule. These memories would have to sustain her through whatever came next. The staging area, when they reached it, was perfect for their purposes. The rock overhang provided natural shelter from above, while the creek offered fresh water and a logical explanation for Claire's survival route. The cave behind the small waterfall was large enough for one person and their basic supplies, dry enough to provide real protection from the elements. Marcus helped Claire arrange her makeshift camp to look like the desperate shelter of someone who had been surviving alone for 2 weeks. Her clothes were scattered as if they had been washed in the creek and hung to dry. Her remaining food was rationed to suggest careful conservation. Her injuries were documented with photos that would support her concussion story. Most importantly, they eliminated every trace of Marcus's presence. His footprints were brushed away, his scent masked with creek water and pine needles, his route to and from the location obscured by natural debris. As the storm intensified and the time for Marcus's departure approached, Claire felt the weight of their impending separation settling over both of them like the gathering snow clouds. They had become partners in this deception, but they were also about to become strangers again, their connection preserved only in memory and the small wooden carving in Claire's pocket. "Ready?" Marcus wrote, though his reluctance to leave was obvious in every line of his posture. "No," Claire said honestly, "but ready or not, it's time." Marcus nodded and began to turn away, then stopped and turned back. For a moment, Claire thought he might try to speak, might attempt to break his decade of silence to say goodbye in words. Instead, he reached into his pack and withdrew his notebook one final time. "Thank you for reminding me that some solitudes are chosen and some are shared. Take care of yourself, Claire Patterson." Before Claire could respond, Marcus melted into the forest like a shadow dissolving at dawn, moving with such skill that within moments she couldn't tell which direction he had gone. She was alone again, but this time the solitude felt different, not empty but full of possibility, not abandoned but trusted with something precious. The storm was building to its full fury now, and soon the search helicopters would return to find her exactly where she needed to be found. Claire settled into her stage shelter and began the process of becoming the person her story required her to be, a confused survivor with memory gaps and a miraculous tale of wilderness endurance. But in her heart, she carried the truth of what had really happened on the mountain, and the knowledge that somewhere in the high country, a man who had rediscovered his voice through silence was building a new life from the wreckage of the old. The real story she knew wasn't the one she would tell the searchers. The real story was about two people who had found exactly what they needed in the last place they expected to look for it, and who had been brave enough to let it go when the time came to move forward. The storm that had protected Marcus's escape became Claire's greatest test. By the time the rescue helicopters found her 3 hours later, she was genuinely hypothermic again, shivering uncontrollably in her stage shelter as snow accumulated around the rock overhang. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now actually experiencing the survival crisis. She was pretending to have endured for 2 weeks. The first searcher to reach her was a paramedic named Rodriguez, who rappelled down from a hovering helicopter with the confident efficiency of someone who had performed this rescue dozens of times. Claire had heard him coming, the distinctive sound of rotor wash, fighting against mountain winds, but she forced herself to remain still, to project the confused disorientation her story required. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Rodriguez called as he approached her shelter. "I'm with Mountain Rescue. You're safe now." Claire looked up at him with deliberately unfocused eyes, allowing confusion and relief to war across her face. "Who ... are you? Where am I?" The questions weren't entirely fabricated. After 3 hours alone in the storm, buffeted by wind and snow that seemed determined to erase all traces of human presence, Claire felt genuinely disoriented. The transition from Marcus's warm, secure cabin to this exposed position had been more jarring than she'd anticipated. Rodriguez immediately began his medical assessment, checking her pulse, examining her pupils with a small flashlight, asking questions designed to evaluate her mental state. "I'm Jake Rodriguez with Colorado Search and Rescue. You're Claire Patterson, right? The journalist from Denver?" Claire nodded slowly, then winced as if the movement caused pain. "I think so. Yes, Claire. But there are gaps, big gaps." "What day is it?" "Tuesday, October 23rd. You've been missing for 2 weeks. Can you tell me what you remember?" This was the crucial moment, the test of whether Claire's carefully constructed deception would hold up under professional scrutiny. She had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times during her wait, but the reality of lying to someone who was risking his life to save her felt more difficult than she had anticipated. "My car," she said, allowing her voice to shake with what could be interpreted as trauma or cold. "I remember sliding off the road. The guardrail ... it didn't hold. Then falling, rolling. After that ... She let her voice trail off, touching her forehead where a genuine cut from the accident had mostly healed. "Pieces, fragments. I remember being cold, being scared, walking by water. But it's like trying to remember a dream." Rodriguez nodded, his expression professional but sympathetic. That's consistent with a significant head injury. We're going to get you to a hospital for a full evaluation, but first we need to get you stabilized and warm. As Rodriguez worked, other team members arrived, additional paramedics, a helicopter pilot coordinating the evacuation, and a search coordinator who began documenting the scene with photographs and GPS readings. Claire watched them work with growing anxiety, noting how thoroughly they examined her shelter, how carefully they recorded the supplies she had survived on. "This is impressive," the search coordinator, a lean woman named Sarah Chun, observed, as she studied Claire's staged campsite. "You did everything right, chose a good shelter location, conserved your resources, stayed near fresh water. Most people wouldn't have made it 2 days in these conditions, let alone 2 weeks." The praise made Claire uncomfortable, knowing it properly belonged to Marcus, who had taught her the principles she was now being credited for discovering on her own. But she maintained her role, responding to questions with appropriate confusion and gaps in memory. "I don't remember much," she repeated when asked about specific survival techniques. "Instinct, maybe. I grew up camping with my family." This was true. Claire had indeed spent childhood summers camping, though nothing in that experience had prepared her for genuine mountain survival. The helicopter evacuation to Denver General Hospital was a surreal experience that felt like transitioning between 2 different worlds. One moment Claire was surrounded by the vast silence of the mountains. The next she was strapped to a gurney in a machine that vibrated with mechanical noise, flying over a landscape that looked alien and hostile from the air. Dr. Amanda Foster, the emergency room physician who examined Claire, was thorough, skeptical, and ultimately convinced by the carefully constructed evidence. Claire's neurological responses were consistent with someone recovering from a significant concussion. Her weight loss, while less than expected for 2 weeks of survival conditions, could be explained by careful resource management. Her psychological state showed signs of trauma, but not the severe breakdown that might be expected from extended isolation. "You're remarkably lucky," Dr. Foster told her after completing the examination, "and remarkably resourceful. The combination of head injury and exposure could easily have been fatal. You'll need to stay overnight for observation, but I don't see any signs of permanent damage." The real test came the next day, when Detective Michael Torres from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation arrived to conduct what he described as a routine interview about her disappearance. Torres was a soft-spoken man with intelligent eyes who specialized in missing persons cases, and Claire could tell immediately that he was not someone who would be easily satisfied with incomplete explanations. "I want to be clear," Torres began, settling into the chair beside her hospital bed. "You're not under investigation for anything. But when someone disappears for 2 weeks and resurfaces with gaps in their memory, we have to ask some questions to make sure we understand what happened." Claire nodded, projecting the cooperative attitude of someone with nothing to hide. "I understand. I wish I could be more helpful, but there's so much I just don't remember." Torres consulted a small notebook. "Let's start with what you do remember. You were driving from Denver to investigate a story about a hermit living in the Viveligana San Juan Mountains. Can you tell me more about that?" This was dangerous territory. Claire had anticipated this question, but knew her answer would be scrutinized carefully. "It was based on local rumors I'd heard. Stories about someone who survived an avalanche that killed his family back in 2014, then disappeared into the mountains. My editor thought it might make an interesting human interest piece." "Did you have any specific information about this person's location?" "Nothing concrete. Just general area descriptions from people in Pine Ridge and a few other towns. I was basically driving around hoping to spot signs of habitation smoke from a chimney, cleared land, that sort of thing." Torres made notes as she spoke. "And during your 2 weeks in the wilderness, did you see any signs of other people? Cabins, campfires, Anything that might indicate someone else living in the area. Claire's heart rate spiked, but she kept her expression neutral. I don't think so. But honestly, Detective, most of those 2 weeks are a blank to me. I remember fragments: being cold, being hungry, the sound of water running. But it's like my brain edited out most of the experience. That's not uncommon with head trauma, Torres acknowledged. But I have to ask, is it possible you encountered this hermit you were looking for? That he helped you survive? The direct question hung in the air like a challenge. Claire met Torres's gaze steadily, calling on every skill she had developed as a journalist to project sincerity while delivering a calculated lie. If I did, I don't remember it, she said simply, which seems unlikely anyway, doesn't it? If someone had been helping me, wouldn't I be in better condition? Wouldn't I have better supplies, more food, some sign that I hadn't been alone? Torres studied her for a long moment, and Claire could see him weighing her responses, looking for inconsistencies or tells that might suggest deception. Finally, he nodded and closed his notebook. You're right. And frankly, the medical evidence supports your account. You show all the signs of someone who survived through luck, skill, and determination rather than outside assistance. The interview concluded with Torres providing Claire his contact information and asking her to call if any additional memories surfaced. As he prepared to leave, he made one final observation that sent a chill down Claire's spine. For what it's worth, Ms. Patterson, I hope you find your hermit story someday. Just maybe try a safer approach next time. The comment was casual, seemingly offhand, but Claire heard the subtle message beneath it. Torres wasn't entirely convinced by her story, but he also didn't have enough evidence to pursue it further. He was letting her know that he would be watching, that any future investigation into mountain hermits would receive extra scrutiny. After Torres left, Claire lay in her hospital bed staring at the ceiling and processing what had just occurred. She had successfully protected Marcus's secret, but the cost was becoming clear. Her original story, the one that had brought her to the mountains in the first place, was now impossible to pursue. Any future attempts to investigate rumors about mountain hermits would immediately connect back to her own mysterious survival, bringing unwanted attention to the very area she was trying to protect. Her editor, Janet Morrison, arrived that afternoon with flowers, relief, and 1,000 questions about Claire's ordeal. Janet was particularly interested in whether Claire had gathered any information about the hermit story before her accident. I know it's not the most important thing right now, Janet said, her tone carefully balanced between concern for Claire's welfare and professional interest in the story. But the magazine's readers would be fascinated by a first-person account of wilderness survival. And if you did find any leads about this mountain man legend before the accident. Claire shook her head. Dead end. Talked to some people in Pine Ridge, but it was all second-hand rumors and folklore. I was probably chasing a story that doesn't exist. It wasn't entirely a lie. The legendary hermit of San Juan, the wild, unkempt mountain man of local folklore, didn't exist. That person was a fiction, a collection of rumors and assumptions that bore no resemblance to the real Marcus Whitfield. The truth was far more complex and interesting than the legend, but it was also far more private and deserving of protection. Janet looked disappointed, but not surprised. Well, the survival story is still compelling. Lost journalist survives 2 weeks in Colorado wilderness. That's a cover story right there. Claire felt a familiar surge of the professional excitement that had once driven her career, but it was tempered now by something else, a reluctance to profit from an experience that felt too personal, too meaningful to be reduced to magazine copy. Maybe, she said noncommittally. Right now I just want to focus on recovering. That evening, alone in her hospital room, as Denver's lights twinkled beyond her window, Claire reached into her jacket pocket and touched the small wooden carving Marcus had given her. The piece was warm from her body heat, its smooth surface. Worn by her constant handling over the past day. For the first time since her rescue, She allowed herself to think fully about what she had left behind on the mountain. Not just Marcus, though his absence felt like a physical ache, but the entire way of life he had shown her. The peace that came from simple tasks done well. The satisfaction of meeting genuine needs with her own hands. The clarity that emerged. From silence and solitude. Claire had saved Marcus's secret, but in doing so, she had also saved something for herself. The knowledge that it was possible to live differently, to find meaning in places where the rest of the world saw only emptiness. Question now was what to do with that knowledge. How to honor what she had learned without betraying the trust that had made the learning possible. Outside her window, the city hummed with its ceaseless activity, millions of people pursuing their complicated lives in the complicated world Claire was about to rejoin. But somewhere in the mountains beyond the lights, a man who had taught her about the value of silence was building a fire in a high shelter, preparing to wait out the winter in the peace he had earned through loss and solitude. Confrontation was over. Claire had won by convincing everyone that nothing important had happened during her 2 weeks in the wilderness. Now came the hardest part, living with the truth of what had actually occurred and figuring out how to carry the mountain's lessons back into the valley of ordinary life. 3 months after her rescue, Claire Patterson stood in her Denver apartment, staring at a resignation letter she had written and rewritten a dozen times. The city stretched beyond her windows, a maze of concrete and glass that seemed to pulse with an energy she no longer understood or wanted to be part of. The apartment itself, once her sanctuary from the chaos of freelance journalism, now felt like a prison cell decorated with the artifacts of a life that no longer fit. The official story of her wilderness survival had made her temporarily famous in the journalism world. Lost in the mountains, a reporter's harrowing tale of survival had been picked up by national outlets, leading to interview requests, speaking opportunities, and job offers from magazines that had previously ignored her work. The irony was bitter. She had finally achieved the professional recognition she had craved, but it was based on a story she couldn't tell and success she didn't want. Janet Morrison had been thrilled with the attention, seeing it as validation of her decision to send Claire on the hermit assignment in the first place. "You've found your niche," Janet had declared during their last meeting. "Survival stories, adventure journalism, extreme situations. The editors at Outside Magazine are very interested in having you do a series on solo wilderness experiences." Claire had smiled and nodded and promised to consider the offer, all while feeling like a fraud participating in her own life. How could she write about wilderness survival when the most profound wilderness experience of her life had to remain secret? How could she accept accolades for endurance and resourcefulness that belonged to someone else? The wooden carving Marcus had given her sat on her desk beside the resignation letter, its presence both comforting and challenging. She had taken to holding it during moments of difficult decision-making, feeling the smooth surface that spoke of patient craftsmanship and deliberate care. It reminded her of everything she had learned on the mountain about the difference between activity and purpose, between being busy and being meaningful. For 3 months, Claire had tried to integrate the lessons of her mountain experience into her city life. She had attempted to bring Marcus's mindful approach to daily tasks, his appreciation for silence and solitude, his focus on what was truly necessary rather than what was merely possible. The results had been mixed at best. Her morning meditation practice, inspired by the silent hours she had shared with Marcus, felt hollow against the backdrop of urban noise. Her attempts at simple living were constantly undermined by the complex demands of modern professional life. Most frustratingly, her newfound appreciation for genuine communication was repeatedly challenged by the shallow interactions that defined much of city social and professional culture. The resignation letter represented more than just leaving her job. It was a rejection of the entire trajectory her life had been following before her mountain experience. But what would replace it? Claire had been asking herself that question for weeks. Without finding a satisfactory answer, the sound of her phone ringing interrupted her contemplation. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and Claire answered with the mixture of affection and apprehension that had characterized their relationship since her return. "Claire, honey, I just wanted to check on you." Her mother's voice carried the worried tone that had become familiar over the past 3 months. "You sounded strange." During our last conversation, Elizabeth Patterson was a retired teacher who lived in Fort Collins, close enough to visit but far enough away to maintain the independence both women preferred. She had been supportive during Claire's recovery, but clearly didn't understand the changes she saw in her daughter. "I'm fine, Mom. Just thinking about some career decisions." "The magazine offered you that permanent position, didn't they?" Janet seemed very excited when she called last week. Claire closed her eyes, remembering the conversation with Janet about Wilderness Quarterly's offer of a senior editor position. It was everything she had thought she wanted: security, respect, creative control over assignments. But accepting it would mean committing to a version of herself that no longer existed. "They did. I'm still considering it." "Claire, after everything you've been through, maybe it's time to think about stability. You've proven yourself as a journalist. You don't need to keep chasing dangerous stories in remote places." The comment stung because it revealed how completely her mother misunderstood what had happened to her. Elizabeth saw the mountain experience as something to recover from, a trauma to overcome and move past. She couldn't see that it had been the most meaningful period of Claire's adult life, the time when she had finally discovered who she might become if she stopped trying to be who others expected her to be. "It's complicated, Mom. It doesn't have to be. Take the job, settle down, maybe start thinking about meeting someone nice. You're 28, Claire. It's time to start building a real life." After ending the call, Claire sat in the gathering dusk of her apartment and felt the weight of expectations pressing down on her from all directions. Her mother wanted her to choose security. Her editor wanted her to capitalize on her newfound fame. Her bank account wanted her to accept the highest-paying offers. The city itself seemed to want her to slip back into the rhythm of professional ambition and social climbing that had defined her pre-mountain existence, but the wooden carving in her hand reminded her of a different set of expectations. The mountain's demand for authenticity, for choosing depth over breadth, for building something meaningful rather than just successful. Claire walked to her computer and began typing. Not the resignation letter this time, but something else entirely. A query letter to Mrs. Chun at the Pine Ridge Post Office, carefully worded to sound like routine business while actually testing the communication system Marcus had established. "Dear Mrs. Chun, I'm a journalist following up on some research I conducted in your area several months ago. I'm wondering if you might have received any mail for M. Whitfield, as I believe I may have some information that would be of interest to him regarding local history preservation efforts. If such correspondence has been received, could you please forward this letter? I can be reached at the address below. Sincerely, C. Patterson." It was a thin pretense, but it served the dual purpose of checking on Marcus's safety while providing him with her current contact information. Claire sealed the letter and walked to the post office, mailing it with the mixture of hope and trepidation that had become familiar whenever she thought about her mountain experience. The response came 2 weeks later, forwarded through Mrs. Chun's post office in an envelope that showed no return address, but bore a postmark from Pine Ridge. Inside was a single sheet of paper with familiar handwriting. "See, winter passed safely. Spring brought new growth to familiar places. Some roots go deeper after harsh seasons. Hope City soil proves equally fertile for important seeds." Claire read the letter dozens of times, parsing each word for additional meaning. Marcus was safe, had survived the winter at his high shelter, and had returned to his cabin. But more than that, his message suggested he understood the challenges she was facing, the difficulty of transplanting mountain wisdom into urban reality, The phrase about roots going deeper after harsh seasons particularly resonated. Claire had been thinking about her mountain experience as something separate from her city life, a beautiful interlude that was difficult to integrate into ordinary existence. But Marcus's letter suggested a different perspective, that the challenges of integration were themselves part of the growth process, that the contrast between mountain and city could deepen rather than diminish the lessons she had learned. Inspired by this new understanding, Claire began making changes to her life that were more radical than her previous attempts at simple living. She gave notice on her expensive downtown apartment and found a small cabin-style house in the foothills west of Denver, close enough to the city for necessary business, but far enough away to maintain some connection to the natural world that had become essential to her well-being. She declined the senior editor position at Wilderness Quarterly, but negotiated a freelance arrangement that would allow her to choose her assignments carefully, focusing on stories that aligned with her values rather than simply advancing her career. The financial uncertainty was terrifying, but the creative freedom was exhilarating. Most importantly, she began developing a new kind of journalism, stories that explored the intersection between urban and rural life, that examined how people found meaning and purpose in an increasingly disconnected world. Her first piece in this new direction was about urban farmers in Denver who were creating community through shared gardens. The second profiled a group of professionals who had started a camping group to reconnect with nature and each other. Work felt different from anything she had done before, more collaborative, more focused on understanding than exposing, more interested in solutions than problems. It wasn't the kind of journalism that would make her famous, but it was the kind that felt meaningful. 6 months after her mountain experience, Claire had created a life that was neither the ambitious urban existence she had pursued before, nor the complete withdrawal that Marcus had chosen. Instead, she had found a middle path that honored both the mountain's lessons and the valley's opportunities. She still practiced morning meditation, but now it was often accompanied by the sound of wind in the pine trees outside her new home. She still valued solitude, but she had learned to distinguish between isolation and healthy boundaries. She still appreciated silence, but she had also discovered the joy of conversation with people who shared her commitment to living deliberately. The transformation wasn't complete. Claire suspected it never would be, but it was authentic in a way her previous life had never been. She had stopped trying to be the person she thought she should be, and had started becoming the person the mountain had shown her she could be. One evening, as she sat on her small porch watching the sun set over the foothills, Claire composed another letter to Marcus. This time, she didn't need to route it through Mrs. Chun or disguise its purpose. She wrote directly about her gratitude for the lessons he had taught her, about the ways his example had helped her rebuild her life according to her own values, rather than others' expectations. Dear Marcus, you once told me that some gifts are meant to be given, not kept. I wanted you to know that the gift of your teaching has found fertile ground. I'm learning to live in a way that honors both the mountain's wisdom and the valley's responsibilities. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to choose depth over breadth, meaning over success, authenticity over approval. The wooden carving sits on my desk as I write this, reminding me daily that some things are worth protecting, some silences are worth preserving, and some connections transcend the need for constant contact. I hope your mountain continues to provide the peace you've earned and the solitude you've chosen. Know that somewhere in the foothills, someone is practicing the lessons you taught about living deliberately and building something meaningful from loss. With deep gratitude and respect, Claire. She didn't mail this letter. Instead, she folded it carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept the mountain carving and the few other precious reminders of her time with Marcus. Some communications, she had learned, were meant for the sender as much as the recipient, ways of clarifying thoughts and feelings rather than transmitting information. But the act of writing, it helped. Claire understood how completely she had integrated the mountain experience into her new life. She was no longer the desperate journalist who had set out to find a hermit's story to save her career. She was no longer the woman who had crashed her car in a snowstorm and nearly died from exposure. She was someone new, someone who had learned to find home in unexpected places, who understood the difference between being alone and being lonely, who had discovered that the most important conversations sometimes happen in complete silence. The mountain had taught her to listen, but the valley was teaching her when to speak. Both lessons she was learning were essential for the life she was building, a life that honored the past while embracing the future, that valued both solitude and community, that sought meaning rather than just success. As the stars appeared over the foothills and the last light faded from the western sky, Claire felt the deep satisfaction that comes from living according to one's own values rather than others' expectations. She was home, not in any particular place, but in the person she had chosen to become. 1 year after her rescue, Claire Patterson received an invitation that changed everything. It arrived in an unmarked envelope with no return address, postmarked from Pine Ridge but containing something she had never expected to see, a map drawn in Marcus's distinctive handwriting, showing a route to a location she didn't recognize, along with a date and time, October 15th, 3 p.m., if you choose to come. Claire studied the map with trembling hands, recognizing the careful detail that characterized all of Marcus's work. This wasn't just directions to a meeting place. It was an invitation back into the world she had thought was permanently closed to her. The location appeared to be a meadow several miles from his cabin, accessible by a trail that avoided the areas where her rescue had taken place. The timing was significant too. October 15th was exactly 1 year from the day Marcus had found her dying in the snow by Willow Creek. He was offering her the chance to return to the mountain, not as a lost journalist or a rescued victim, but as someone who had earned the right to be there through the choices she had made in the years since. Leaving. Claire spent the days leading up to the meeting preparing with the same careful attention to detail that Marcus had taught her. She arranged time away from her freelance assignments, packed appropriate gear for mountain weather, and made the drive to Pine Ridge with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that felt like coming home and going to an interview simultaneously. Trail shown on Marcus's map was one she had never seen during her original stay, winding through aspen groves that had turned brilliant gold in the autumn air. As she climbed higher, following landmarks that proved Marcus's cartographic skills were as precise as everything else he did, Claire found herself falling back into the rhythm of mountain walking, deliberate steps, controlled breathing, attention to the subtle signs that revealed the forest's mood and weather intentions. She reached the designated meadow 15 minutes early and immediately understood why Marcus had chosen this location. It was a natural amphitheater surrounded by peaks that created perfect acoustics while providing privacy from any casual observers. A small creek ran along one edge, and the remains of what appeared to be an old Forest Service fire ring suggested this had once been an official campsite. Marcus was already there, sitting on a fallen log near the creek with the patient stillness she remembered so well. He looked exactly as she remembered, beard neatly trimmed, clothes practical but well-maintained, eyes that seemed to see everything without judgment. The only difference was something indefinable in his posture, a sense of peace that seemed even deeper than what she had observed during her stay at his cabin. When he saw her approaching, Marcus stood and nodded, not the formal acknowledgement of strangers, but the greeting of old friends who understood that some relationships transcended ordinary social conventions. Claire felt a surge of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. This man had saved her life, taught her how to live, and then given her the space to discover what that meant in her own world. "Hello, Marcus," she said simply, settling onto another fallen log that formed a natural seating area around the old fire ring. Marcus smiled, an expression she had rarely seen during their time together, but which transformed his entire face and withdrew his familiar notebook. "Hello, Claire Patterson. You look well." "I am well. Better than I've been in years, actually. Thank you for inviting me." "Thank you for coming. Wasn't sure you would." Claire understood his uncertainty. A year was a long time, and people changed. He had no way of knowing whether her mountain experience had been a temporary aberration that she had outgrown, or whether it had fundamentally altered her in ways that would endure. "I've thought about this place every day for a year," she said. "Honestly, not just the mountain, but what it represents. What you taught me about choosing the life you actually want instead of the life everyone expects you to want." Marcus nodded and wrote, "Hard lesson to learn, harder to practice. Yes, but worth it. I've rebuilt my entire life around the principles you showed me. It's been terrifying and wonderful, and more difficult than I expected." Claire found herself telling Marcus about the past year, about leaving her expensive apartment and moving to the foothills, about changing her approach to journalism, about learning to distinguish between genuine solitude and mere loneliness. She described the challenges of maintaining mountain wisdom in a valley world, the way she had to constantly choose depth over superficiality, meaning over convenience. Marcus listened with the complete attention she remembered, occasionally asking questions through his written notes, but mostly just absorbing her words with the focused presence that had been one of his greatest gifts as a teacher. "You've done something rare," he wrote when she finished. "Most people who find peace in the mountains leave it behind when they return to the world. You brought it with you." "I had a good teacher," Claire replied, "and I had the right motivation. I wasn't running away from something anymore. I was running toward something. There's a big difference." "Yes, took me 5 years to learn that difference." Claire hesitated, then asked the question that had been building throughout their conversation. "Marcus, why did you invite me here? After a year of silence, why reach out now?" Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring into the creek that bubbled between them. When he finally began writing, his hand moved slowly, as if each word required careful consideration. "Year ago, you asked me to teach you how to live like this. Thought I was teaching you survival skills, mountain wisdom. Realized later you were teaching me something too. What was that? That isolation and solitude are different things. That some silences are chosen and some are shared. That protecting something precious doesn't mean hiding it completely." Claire felt her breath catch as she understood the implications of what Marcus was saying. "You're not alone anymore, are you?" Marcus shook his head and wrote, "Met someone. Another person who needed the mountain's healing. Turns out there are more of us than I thought." The revelation shouldn't have surprised. Claire Marcus had always possessed the qualities that would make him an extraordinary teacher and guide for others seeking what he had found, but hearing that he had opened his world to someone else felt like confirmation that their time together had changed him as much as it had changed her. "Tell me about them," Claire said, curious about the person who had succeeded in drawing Marcus back into human connection. "His name is David. Lost his husband in Afghanistan. Couldn't find peace in the civilian world. Found him last spring, hypothermic and lost after leaving his car on the highway. Sound familiar?" Claire laughed, recognizing the pattern. "You have a habit of rescuing people, don't you? Mountain brings the people who need to be here. I just help them understand what they found." And David stayed, building his own cabin 2 miles upstream. Learning what you learned, how to choose depth over breadth, meaning over success. Different person, same journey. Claire absorbed this information, understanding that Marcus had discovered something she had suspected during her own time with him, that his gifts as a teacher were too valuable to be hoarded, that the peace he had found was meant to be shared rather than hidden. "Is that why you invited me back? To see if I might want to join this community?" Marcus studied her for a moment before writing, "No, invited you back to see if you want to help build it." Distinction was crucial. Marcus wasn't offering Claire a place to retreat from the world. He was inviting her to help create something new, a bridge between the mountain's wisdom and the valley's needs. What did you have in mind? Marcus pulled out a larger piece of paper, another hand-drawn map, but this one showed a broader area of the mountains with multiple locations marked. David and I have been talking. There are others like us, like you. People who need what the mountain offers but can't or won't disappear completely. People who want to learn these lessons without abandoning their responsibilities in the world below. Claire studied the map, seeing the vision Marcus was describing. Multiple small settlements connected by trails, each one a sanctuary for healing and learning, but also connected to the broader world, through people like herself who moved between the mountain and the valley. A network, she said, understanding. Not a retreat from the world, but a resource for it. Exactly, teaching what we've learned to people who need it, then sending them back to spread the lessons further. You proved it was possible to take mountain wisdom into valley life. And you want me to help coordinate that? To be the link between the mountain teachers and the valley students? Marcus nodded. You understand both worlds now. You've lived the transition. And you have skills we need: communication, organization, the ability to reach people who need this but don't know it exists. Claire felt the pieces of her life clicking together in a way that was both surprising and inevitable. This was why she had been drawn to the mountain in the first place, why her rescue had felt like destiny rather than accident, why her year of rebuilding had felt like preparation rather than recovery. I would need to maintain my life in the valley, she said, thinking through the practical implications. Keep my freelance work, my home in the foothills. But I could spend time here regularly, maybe bring small groups of people who are ready for this kind of learning. That's what we hoped. Bridge between worlds, not abandonment of either. Claire looked around the meadow, imagining it as Marcus described, a gathering place where people could come to learn what she had learned, to find what she had found, to discover that there were alternatives to the desperate pursuit of success and approval that characterized so much of modern life. When would we start? Already started, Marcus wrote, and Claire saw that familiar almost smile cross his face. First student arrives next week. Someone you recommended, actually. Claire looked confused until Marcus handed her another piece of paper, a photocopy of an email she had sent months earlier to Janet Morrison, recommending that the magazine interview a young journalist named Sarah Kim who was struggling with burnout and depression after covering traumatic news stories for several years. Sarah contacted you? Not directly. Mrs. Chun mentioned a young woman asking questions about mountain hermits. Said you had told her Pine Ridge was a good place to start research. Took me a while to connect the dots. Claire laughed, realizing that her casual attempt to help a struggling colleague had created exactly the kind of connection Marcus was describing. The network was already forming naturally, through the relationships and recommendations of people who had been touched by the mountain's healing. So I'm not the first bridge you've built. You're the prototype, the proof that it works. Everything else is just expansion. As the afternoon light began to slant through the aspen trees, Claire and Marcus continued planning what would become known to the few people who needed to know about it as the Mountain Network. Not a formal organization or institution, but a loose confederation of teachers and students, guides and seekers, all connected by their shared understanding that there were different ways to live, different definitions of success, different paths to meaning and peace. When it was time to leave, Marcus walked with Claire partway down the trail, something he had never done during her original stay. At the point where their paths diverged, his leading back to his cabin, hers toward the parking area where she had left her car, he stopped and withdrew his notebook one final time. Same question as a year ago. Different meaning now. What question? Marcus wrote carefully, his handwriting precise despite the fading light. Please say my name. Claire understood immediately. A year ago, those words would have been a request for him to break his silence, to speak for the first time in a decade. Now they were something else entirely, an invitation for her to name what they had built together, to give voice to the vision they were creating. Claire looked at Marcus, at the mountains rising around them, at the trail that would take her back to her valley life and forward into a future that honored both worlds. The Mountain Speaks Network, she said, the name coming to her with complete certainty. A place where silence teaches, where solitude heals, where people learn that some of the most important conversations happen without words. Marcus nodded once, a gesture that contained approval, gratitude, and blessing in equal measure. Then, he turned and walked back toward his mountain home, leaving Claire to make her own way down the trail toward a life that would never again be entirely separate from the peaks that had taught her how to live. As she drove back toward Denver, Claire touched the wooden carving in her pocket and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding one's purpose. She was still a journalist, still a valley dweller, still someone who moved through the ordinary world of deadlines and obligations. But she was also something new, a translator between silence and speech, a bridge between mountain wisdom and valley need, a living proof that it was possible to find extraordinary meaning in the midst of ordinary life. The mountain man had found his voice again, not through speaking, but through teaching others to listen. And Claire Patterson had found her story at last, not the one she had come to the mountains to capture, but the one she had been meant to live all along. In the rearview mirror, the peaks disappeared behind the curve of the road, but Claire knew she would be back. Not as a visitor or a student anymore, but as a partner in something larger than either the mountain or the valley could offer alone, a new way of being human that honored both solitude and community, both silence and speech, both the wisdom of withdrawal and the courage of engagement. The mountain man hadn't spoken in 10 years, until she asked him to say her name. Now together, they were teaching others to find their own voices in the space between silence and sound, in the place where healing begins and authentic life takes root. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.